Vienna, 1903. The streets were thick with the smoke of coal lamps and the restless hum of a city caught between two worlds, the glittering dawn of modern science and the shadowed lure of the occult. On one side, Sigmund Freud sat at his desk in Birdgas 19, sketching out the foundations of psychoanalysis: dreams as gateways, repression as disease, hysteria as mystery. On the other side, in dimly lit drawing rooms across the city, aristocrats and widows alike gathered in silence around tables, fingers interlocked, breath held, waiting for the voices of the dead to speak. Vienna was a city of waltzes and whispers, of logic and longing, of doctors dissecting the mind while citizens clung to seances that promised comfort from beyond. It was into this delicate tension that a patient entered Freud's care, carrying with her a claim that would unsettle even the most rational of minds: she could speak to the dead. Her story did not begin with Freud. It began in grief, in the aching void left when someone dear passed beyond the veil. For this woman, the loss was unbearable, but what followed seemed stranger than mourning. She reported hearing voices, not in the ordinary sense of madness, but in conversations. She claimed they were not hallucinations but presences, recognizable and insistent. They whispered secrets no living soul should have known, fragments of memory and truth that chilled those who dared listen. In her trances, she would speak in languages she had never learned. She described landscapes of the afterlife as though she had walked them, returning with details too vivid to dismiss. To Freud, such phenomena presented both a professional challenge and a personal provocation. Freud himself was no stranger to uncanny encounters. Though history remembers him as the rationalist who mapped the unconscious, he harbored a lifelong fascination with the paranormal. He wrote about uncanny experiences and entertained the possibility that unseen forces might shape the mind. Yet he clung to science, to the language of nerves and repression, wary of falling into the chaos of superstition. When this patient came forward, she forced him to confront the boundary between psychology and the supernatural. Was she suffering from hysteria, the fashionable diagnosis of the era? Was she inventing frauds to gain attention? Or had she stumbled into something that science could not yet name? The world around her was primed for belief. Newspapers carried accounts of mediums in Paris and London, of table-rapping spirits and ectoplasmic hands emerging from the dark. In Vienna salons, the well-to-do whispered about ghostly visitations while scientists scoffed in journals. But beneath the scoffing lurked a genuine fear. What if the line between the living and the dead was not as solid as they wanted it to be? What if death could speak back? For a city already haunted by war memories, epidemics, and the fragility of life, such questions carried a dangerous weight. This case mattered not only because of its strangeness, but because it arrived at the very moment Freud's theories were taking root. He was positioning himself as the interpreter of the unconscious, a man who could decode dreams, unravel neuroses, and bring hidden truths into daylight. And here, before him, was a patient who embodied all the themes he pursued: dream states, repressed trauma, symbolic language, but with the terrifying twist of supernatural intrusion. To accept her claims would risk his reputation. To dismiss them outright might blind him to the deeper realities of her suffering. It was a dilemma that reached beyond medicine into the realm of philosophy. What is madness? What is memory? And what is beyond human comprehension? The patient's presence in Freud's practice was like a candle flickering in a crypt. It drew curiosity, dread, and speculation. Those who heard of her wondered if she was truly in contact with lost souls, or if she was simply a woman broken by grief and the weight of expectations placed upon her gender. Women of her time were often silenced, their voices dismissed as hysteria when they defied convention. But here was a woman who insisted her voice was not her own. It belonged to the dead. Her defiance of silence carried both a social and spiritual charge, making her story even more dangerous to ignore. As we step into this account, we must remember that Vienna was more than Freud's laboratory. It was a crossroads of empires, ideologies, and faiths. Spiritualism thrived in the same streets where medical lectures dissected the brain. It was a place where the mind itself seemed porous, open to forces invisible yet undeniable. And so, this story is not only about one patient or one doctor. It is about the uneasy marriage of science and the supernatural, about how grief and longing can blur the edges of reality, and about how even the father of psychoanalysis could not entirely escape the chill of the unknown. This is not a tale with easy answers. It is not the story of a simple fraud, nor of a clear miracle. It is, instead, a haunting glimpse into the human condition, our need to believe, our terror of death, and our endless search for meaning in the shadows. Freud's patient who claimed to speak with the dead remains a figure suspended between history and legend, a voice echoing from Vienna's darkened rooms, asking us still, what if death is not silence at all, but a conversation waiting to be heard? Vienna at the dawn of the 20th century was a city of contradictions, a glittering capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and at the same time a cauldron of uncertainty, superstition, and fear. In 1903, its cobbled streets echoed with the sound of horse-drawn carriages carrying the elite to opera houses, coffee houses, and secret gatherings alike. The city radiated culture. Gustav Klimt was painting gilded canvases, Arnold Schoenberg was breaking the rules of music, and intellectual circles debated philosophy and science late into the night. Yet beneath this shimmering facade, Vienna was also a city haunted by shadows. Death, disease, and poverty loomed in its crowded tenements, and spiritualism found fertile ground among both the desperate poor and the fashionable aristocracy. To understand Freud's patient, one must first understand this peculiar cultural soil in which science and superstition lived side by side. The 19th century had ended with revolutions of thought. Charles Darwin had shaken religious certainties, while advances in medicine promised mastery over the human body. Yet these triumphs of rationalism did not extinguish belief in the supernatural. They seemed, paradoxically, to fuel it. The more science explained, the more people longed for mysteries that science could not touch. Vienna became a meeting place for this hunger. Seances were no longer confined to dusty parlors. They entered drawing rooms of the wealthy, where candles flickered on velvet-draped tables, and whispers of ectoplasm and phantom knocks mingled with the laughter of the social elite. To lose someone in those days, when illness could steal a life without warning, was to live in perpetual grief. Spiritualism offered comfort, an illusion perhaps, but one that soothed a wound medicine could not heal. At the same time, Vienna was also the epicenter of a new science of the mind. Sigmund Freud, still consolidating his reputation, worked feverishly to chart the territory of dreams and neuroses. He and his contemporaries challenged old models of madness, suggesting that mental illness was not demonic possession or mere weakness of will but the expression of unconscious conflicts. Psychoanalysis was radical, daring, and unsettling. For many Viennese citizens, it was as strange and frightening as the thought of ghosts. Both spiritualism and psychoanalysis asked their participants to believe in invisible forces. One claimed to speak with the spirits of the dead, the other with the buried voices of the living. Both challenged the notion of rational, conscious control. This parallel, though rarely acknowledged openly, made Freud's patient's case all the more disturbing. The city's intellectual climate amplified this tension. Cafes buzzed with conversation, and it was not unusual for a painter, a composer, and a doctor to share a table, debating whether humanity was progressing toward enlightenment or collapsing into decadence. Vienna was obsessed with death. Funerals were grand affairs, and the city's cemeteries were treated as monuments. Tombs were adorned with elaborate sculptures, and mourning rituals became almost theatrical. In this environment, communication with the dead felt less like a fringe belief and more like a natural extension of everyday life. When Freud's patient claimed she heard voices from beyond, she was echoing a yearning embedded deeply in the city's culture. Vienna's fascination with the occult was not confined to the drawing room. Institutions, too, flirted with the paranormal. Scholars and scientists conducted experiments on mediums, seeking to prove or debunk claims of spiritual contact. The Society for Psychical Research in London had its echoes in Central Europe, where intellectuals wondered if the human mind had hidden powers. Newspapers eagerly reported on seances, both to entertain and to scandalize. Fraudulent mediums were exposed, yet just as many continued to attract devoted followers. This constant tension, between exposure and belief, between science and mystery, was the very air Freud and his patient breathed. Freud's own Vienna was also a city of repression, both social and personal. Morality was rigid, particularly around sexuality, and women bore the weight of silence. For them, grief and suffering were often dismissed as hysteria. It is no accident that spiritualism attracted so many women, who found in seances a space to speak, to weep, to channel voices that society otherwise ignored. The patient who came to Freud claiming to speak with the dead carried within her not only personal grief but also the larger burden of a society unwilling to hear women in their own voices. The spirit she spoke for may have been, in part, an echo of this silencing. Meanwhile, Freud himself stood at the crossroads of belief and skepticism. He rejected the easy explanations of spirits but did not dismiss the power of the unconscious to create experiences that felt real. For him, Vienna's seance rooms and hospital wards were two sides of the same coin, one framed by superstition, the other by science, yet both filled with the same human longing. That longing was to make sense of the unseen forces that governed life and death. The patient who claimed to speak to the dead was therefore not an anomaly. She was a product of her time and her city. The turn-of-the-century Viennese environment gave her claims an eerie plausibility. In another city, she might have been dismissed outright, perhaps even institutionalized as mad. But in Vienna, she could command attention, attracting both curiosity and fear, both believers and skeptics. Her voice joined the chorus of countless mediums, mystics, and dreamers who defined the cultural underbelly of a city that outwardly worshipped reason. And it was this contradiction, this uneasy dance between rationalism and the supernatural, that ensured her story would not simply be one of private illness, but one of cultural significance. Vienna in 1903 was a city where the boundary between science and magic blurred like candle smoke in a crowded salon. It was a place where Freud's careful theories of repression might sit uneasily beside whispered incantations in a séance. To understand Freud's patient, one must first walk these streets, listening to the waltzes drifting from gilded halls, feeling the weight of coffins lowered into ornate graves, and hearing, in the spaces between, the restless murmur of a city forever caught between the living and the dead. Freud's professional world in 1903 was one of turbulence, ambition, and transformation. Though his name today carries an almost mythical weight, at the turn of the century he was still fighting for legitimacy. Psychoanalysis was not yet a universally accepted discipline, but rather a radical experiment in understanding the hidden machinery of the mind. Freud's clinic in Berggasse 19 served as both laboratory and battlefield. There, amidst the scent of tobacco and the clutter of antiquities he so adored, he gathered his patients and his disciples, intent on carving a new path in medicine. Yet the case of a woman who claimed to converse with the dead would not only test his theories but threatened to blur the lines between science and superstition in ways that unsettled even him. In these years, Freud's circle was small but passionate. Men like Wilhelm Stekel, Alfred Adler, and later Carl Jung began to orbit his work, each drawn to his daring notion that unconscious forces shaped human behavior. They met regularly to discuss cases, ideas, and interpretations, often with heated disagreements that revealed just how fragile and revolutionary this new science was. Freud was the undeniable leader, yet he was also deeply aware of how precarious his position remained within the wider medical community. His theories of repression, of dreams as wish fulfillments, of sexuality at the core of neuroses, these were not only controversial but scandalous to a conservative society that valued order and silence. For Freud, credibility was everything, and a patient claiming supernatural gifts was the sort of anomaly that could either illuminate the unconscious or wreck his reputation. Freud's theories at this time revolved around hysteria and repression. He believed that symptoms, paralysis, fainting spells, compulsions, were the embodied expressions of repressed memories and desires. Women were often at the center of these cases, for Victorian and Viennese society alike placed heavy moral restrictions on their lives. What could not be spoken aloud emerged in symptoms that seemed to defy rational explanation. To Freud, the unconscious was not simply a dark corner of the mind, it was the very stage on which unspoken dramas played themselves out. His work with patients like Anna O had already revealed to him how grief, trauma, and forbidden impulses might erupt in uncanny forms. Against this backdrop, a patient who heard voices of the dead seemed both plausible and perilous. The intellectual climate of Freud's inner circle was steeped in skepticism toward the paranormal. They debated hypnosis, suggestion, and the strange powers of the unconscious, but few dared to openly embrace spiritualist claims. Still, Freud himself was more ambivalent than many imagine. Though he maintained a public image of rational skepticism, his writings contain hints of fascination with what he called the uncanny, those moments when the familiar becomes frightening, when repressed thoughts return in distorted, ghostly forms. He did not believe in ghosts, but he did not dismiss the possibility that the human mind could produce experiences indistinguishable from them. It was this ambivalence that made his engagement with the patient so compelling. She did not fit neatly into hysteria, nor could she be written off as a simple fraud. She stood as a living test of Freud's own struggle with the boundaries of science. Berggasse 19 itself became a symbol of this tension. The waiting room filled with patients seeking relief from phobias, obsessions, and grief, while upstairs Freud arranged his collection of ancient artifacts, Egyptian statues, Roman busts, Greek urns. These relics of death and afterlife were not merely decoration. They represented his obsession with the persistence of memory, with the layers of the psyche as archaeological strata to be excavated. Surrounded by these symbols of civilizations long gone, Freud listened to his patients speak of the dead as though they were near. For him, Her words were not evidence of spirits but of repressed truths buried in her unconscious. Yet the eerie echo between his antiquities and her claims was difficult to ignore. The discussions within Freud's circle regarding such cases were often charged. Some saw them as fascinating curiosities, demonstrations of suggestion and dissociation. Others warned that indulging them lent dangerous credibility to superstition. The medical establishment already accused Freud of overreaching, of inventing illnesses where none existed, of corrupting patients with sexual interpretations. To engage with a patient who claimed supernatural powers risked confirming their worst suspicions. And yet Freud did not turn her away. Perhaps he saw in her a chance to deepen his theories of repression. Perhaps he was intrigued by the theatricality of her trances, or perhaps, in his private hours, he wondered whether she represented something beyond the grasp of his science. It is worth noting that Freud's circle of colleagues would later splinter, each taking his ideas in different directions. Adler would emphasize social factors, Jung would embrace myth and mysticism, and Steckel would venture into more controversial interpretations. But in 1903, they were united under Freud's leadership, still bound by the shared sense of being pioneers. The patient's case, with its whispers from beyond, highlighted the precariousness of their mission. Were they uncovering the true architecture of the human mind, or merely replacing one form of superstition with another? Freud's insistence on grounding his theories in observable patterns, even when they led him into uncomfortable territory, set him apart. The clash between Freud's clinical skepticism and Vienna's spiritualist fascination mirrored the wider conflict of his time. Scientists wanted to banish the ghosts of superstition, but the public would not let them go so easily. For Freud, the patient became a mirror reflecting this cultural battle. He had to decide whether her voices belonged to hysteria, to trauma, or to the realm of the dead. Whatever answer he chose, it would speak not only to her suffering but to the future of psychoanalysis itself. His theories would either stand firm against the tide of spiritualism or risk being drowned by it. In the end, Freud's world in 1903 was one of thresholds. His patients stood at the threshold between sanity and madness, his theories at the threshold between ridicule and recognition, his city at the threshold between science and superstition. And into this charged environment stepped a woman whose voice carried not only her own grief but the weight of an entire culture's fear of death. For Freud and his circle, she was both a challenge and an opportunity, a chance to test the limits of psychoanalysis, and a reminder that even in an age of reason, the dead still demanded to be heard. She was not Freud's most famous patient, and history has hidden her name behind pseudonyms and fragments, but in 1903 Vienna she was unforgettable. She entered his consulting room carrying with her a strange and fragile energy, the quiet elegance of an upper-middle-class woman touched by grief, combined with a haunted expression that unsettled those who met her. She was not destitute or uneducated. On the contrary, she came from a family that valued refinement and culture. Yet beneath that polished exterior was a mind rattled by loss, and it was in that loss that her claims of speaking to the dead were born. Her suffering began, as many such cases did, with bereavement. The death of someone close, perhaps a parent, perhaps a sibling, perhaps a child, left her reeling. In an era when mourning was ritualized, when women were expected to don black and retreat into silence for months or even years, she found herself unable to bear the void. But instead of fading into numbness, she claimed something else took its place: voices. At first, they were faint, like the echo of a memory. Then they grew stronger. She described them as clear and distinct, the voices of those she had loved, calling her name in the night, whispering secrets no stranger could know. These voices, she insisted, were not hallucinations. They were the dead, returning to speak. In her sessions with Freud, she recounted these experiences with unnerving detail. Sometimes the voices seemed external, spoken from a corner of the room. At other times they came through her own mouth, as if her body had become a vessel. She would slip into trances, her eyelids fluttering, her voice changing pitch, words pouring out as though dictated from beyond. She spoke in accents foreign to her upbringing, occasionally in languages she had never been taught. Witnesses swore they heard her channel entire conversations in tongues utterly unfamiliar to her. To those who wanted to believe, she was a medium. To skeptics, she was delusional. To Freud, she was something else entirely, a case study in the power of the unconscious. The woman described visions that accompanied the voices. She claimed to see dim corridors lined with shadows, fields filled with the silent dead, and strange landscapes where the living and the departed mingled. These were not vague impressions but vivid images that she could recount with precision. Her hands shook when she described them, as though she was still walking through those ghostly spaces. For her, These visions were not dreams. They were journeys, excursions into a realm where grief and longing were answered with presence. Yet they terrified her as much as they consoled her. She sought Freud not because she wanted to become a medium, but because she feared she was losing her mind. Freud listened carefully. He did not laugh at her, as others might have. He questioned her history, probing for trauma, for repression, for moments of loss or humiliation that might have carved these voices into her psyche. He asked about her family, about childhood memories, about the relationships that might have left scars invisible to others. He noted her posture, her gestures, the way her voice shifted as she spoke of the dead. He considered whether hysteria explained her trances, whether suggestion or unconscious wish could account for the uncanny knowledge she sometimes displayed. Yet even as he worked within the framework of psychoanalysis, the strangeness of her case pressed upon him. Those who knew her outside the clinic whispered about her séances. Though she had not sought fame, word spread quickly in Vienna salons. Some invited her to gatherings, where she would reluctantly sit at a table, hands trembling, and slip into a trance. The atmosphere was thick with tension, candles gutted, silence pressed down, and then her voice would rise, deeper and steadier than her own. She would deliver messages from beyond, sometimes banal, sometimes startlingly personal. On one occasion, she reportedly revealed details of a deceased relative's secret that no one alive should have known. This left her audience shaken. Was she a fraud with uncanny intuition? A woman of delicate nerves manipulated by her subconscious? Or something far stranger? What made her so unsettling was not only what she said, but how she said it. Observers describe her face altering during trances, her features tightening, her expression foreign, as if someone else were momentarily inhabiting her body. These transformations lent credibility to her claims in the eyes of the gullible and inspired fear in those who resisted belief. The notion of possession, of a body borrowed by the dead, clashed with Freud's scientific perspective. Yet he could not deny that her condition carried a raw theatricality, a lived drama that was difficult to explain away. The woman herself was conflicted. She did not revel in the attention, nor did she seek money as many professional mediums did. Instead, she seemed trapped in a cycle of fear and need. The voices comforted her grief but isolated her from society. Neighbors and acquaintances whispered behind her back. Some pitted her as a widow or bereaved daughter overcome by sorrow. Others branded her unstable, even dangerous. Her sessions with Freud became her lifeline, the one place where she could speak openly about what she experienced without being dismissed outright. In his office, at least, she was heard, even if the interpretation of her words transformed spirits into symptoms. For Freud, her case was a delicate balancing act. He needed to maintain clinical authority while allowing her to reveal her inner world. He could not afford to indulge her supernatural claims, yet he could not silence her without risking the therapeutic process. Her story pushed him into uncomfortable territory, forcing him to consider the possibility that the unconscious could generate experiences so convincing that they felt indistinguishable from supernatural encounters. Perhaps the dead were not speaking at all, he reasoned, but her repressed desires and unprocessed grief were returning in the form of voices, dressed in the guise of spirits. Still, the question lingered. How did she know things she should not have known? Her ability to reveal hidden truths, to channel secrets that startled her listeners, defied easy explanation. Freud considered cryptomnesia, memories absorbed unconsciously and later recalled as if they were new. He weighed the power of suggestion, the way an anxious audience might interpret vague statements as profound revelations. Yet beneath these rationalizations, the mystery remained, gnawing at the edges of analysis. The patient was, in many ways, a symbol of her time. A woman confined by mourning customs, silenced by societal expectations, and haunted by losses she could not articulate. Spiritualism gave her a voice, literally. Freud's psychoanalysis gave her another. Between these two worlds, she lived in tension, embodying the city's own divided soul. To Freud, she was not simply a case study but a confrontation with the limits of his science. For Vienna, she was a whisper of the supernatural intruding on the rational. And for herself, she was a woman torn between grief and madness, between solace and terror, between the living and the dead. The séances began quietly, almost hesitantly, but before long they became the heart of the patient's strange reputation. Vienna in 1903 was already thick with parlors where tables rapped, curtains quivered, and mediums promised to summon loved ones from beyond. Yet when Freud's patient entered these dimly lit rooms, something about her presence felt different. She did not carry herself like the flamboyant spiritualists who thrived on spectacle. She seemed reluctant, as though her gift was a burden. Still, when she slipped into her trances, the air shifted, and even the most skeptical attendees felt an involuntary shiver crawl down their spines. The settings of these seances were always the same: heavy curtains drawn tight, lamps extinguished, candles flickering low. Participants, well-dressed men and women from Vienna's social and intellectual circles, sat in silence around polished wooden tables. They held hands, sometimes at her insistence, sometimes because they needed the comfort of human touch in the suffocating dark. The patient sat at the head of the table, her posture erect but her face already pale, eyes heavy as though she was slipping into another world. Then, slowly, her breathing changed. Her chest rose and fell in deep, deliberate waves, her hands twitched, and her voice began to hum with tones that seemed not entirely her own. At first, she would murmur, broken words, half-phrases, gasps as though someone were whispering in her ear. Then, in an instant, her voice would change. It dropped lower, steadier, carrying a resonance that made it hard to believe it was coming from her throat. Witnesses said the cadence was uncanny, as if another speaker had entered the room. She spoke names of relatives long buried, names of lovers lost, names of children taken too young. Each time, the silence around her deepened, broken only by the gasps of those present. More than once, an attendee swore she revealed a family secret known only to the deceased and a single survivor. One chilling account described her summoning the voice of a soldier who had died in a border conflict. His widow, seated at the table, burst into tears as the patient spoke in his dialect, using intimate phrases she claimed had never spoken aloud to anyone else. Another evening, she slipped into a trance and began reciting fragments of a poem in French, a language she was never taught, before revealing details of a Parisian man's final illness. These revelations spread rapidly through whispers across Vienna salons. Skeptics dismissed them as coincidence, or as cold reading sharpened by keen observation. But believers left shaken, convinced that she was no mere hysteric but a true medium. The seance atmosphere was not limited to voices. Attendees reported phenomena that seemed to transcend her body. A sudden drop in temperature, the inexplicable scent of flowers, the rattling of objects on shelves. Once, during a sitting, the flame of a single candle stretched high into a thin, unnatural column, though no draught touched the room. Whether these were tricks of perception, manipulations of expectation, or something stranger, they lodged in the minds of witnesses, haunting them long after. For Freud, hearing such reports was deeply unsettling. He was a man of science, yet he knew the power of suggestion could create real sensations: cold air felt on the skin, strange noises magnified by fear. But he also knew that dismissing every phenomenon outright risked overlooking something profound in the human psyche. The patient herself described the experience of trance as both exhausting and terrifying. She often awoke from seances drenched in sweat, her throat raw, her limbs trembling. Sometimes she had no memory of what had been said. Other times she recalled fragments, echoes of voices she insisted were not her own. She feared these episodes, yet she also confessed that they gave her a fleeting sense of relief, as though the dead offered her a temporary reprieve from her grief. Freud noted this duality. The seances both tormented and soothed her, binding her in a cycle she could neither fully embrace nor escape. Those closest to her sessions left behind accounts tinged with awe and suspicion. Some were convinced of her authenticity, citing the specificity of her revelations. Others accused her of deception, though none could prove deliberate fraud. A few believed she had unconsciously absorbed information over the years, snippets of overheard conversations, gossip, and unconscious memory that later resurfaced in trance. Freud himself leaned toward this explanation, speculating that her unconscious mind hidden knowledge and released it in moments of dissociation. But still, he could not account for the raw emotional impact her words carried, the visceral way they pierced her listeners. It is important to remember that these seances unfolded in a society hungry for contact with the beyond. The late Victorian and early modern world had been ravaged by disease and conflict, leaving families desperate for consolation. Mediums thrived because they offered not proof, but comfort. For Freud's patient, however, the matter was more personal. She was not a performer seeking fame or payment. She was a grieving woman whose voices threatened to consume her, a woman whose encounters with the dead bled into her daily life. Her seances were not performances. They were crises, extensions of the suffering that had driven her to Freud in the first place. The most unsettling element was the transformation she underwent in front of others. Eyewitnesses swore her expression changed during trance. Her jaw set, her gaze turned distant, her voice hardened into tones alien to her. One observer described her as a woman possessed, though he hesitated to say by what. Freud interpreted these changes as the eruption of repressed identities, fragments of her psyche splitting into different roles. Yet for those seated in the darkened room, the distinction between psychology and possession blurred. They left her seances with trembling hands, uncertain whether they had witnessed madness, deception, or the intrusion of the dead themselves. By 1903, her reputation had spread far enough that she drew interest beyond Freud's practice. Journalists whispered about her in coded lines. Intellectuals debated her in cafes. She had become both a fascination and a threat, a woman who embodied Vienna's divided soul. Some sought her out, eager to witness the uncanny. Others avoided her, fearful of what it might mean to sit in a room where the dead were said to speak. Freud, meanwhile, faced a growing challenge. Her seances could not be ignored, yet if he acknowledged them too openly, his reputation as a man of science risked collapse. If he dismissed them entirely, he risked silencing a patient whose suffering demanded understanding. The seances, then, were more than entertainment or curiosity. They were a stage on which the cultural battle between reason and mystery played itself out. They drew Vienna's attention not only because of what she claimed, but because of what she represented, the possibility that the veil between the living and the dead was thinner than anyone wished to believe. For Freud, each account of her trances was both a puzzle and a provocation. Were these truly voices from beyond, or voices from within, unleashed by the unconscious? In those candlelit rooms, as words of the dead flowed through her lips, that distinction mattered less than the chilling truth her presence revealed. The dead, in one form or another, still lived in the minds of the living. Freud's interpretation of the patient's condition was never simple, nor could it be. To him, every symptom was a text, every trance a coded message from the unconscious that demanded translation. The woman who claimed to speak with the dead presented him with a particularly layered riddle, and his responses revealed both the strengths and the limitations of early psychoanalysis. On one hand, he insisted her voices and visions were not supernatural in origin. On the other, he recognized they held a psychological truth that demanded careful attention. To Freud, she was not a fraud, but she was also not a prophet of the beyond. She was a vessel, channeling the language of repression, grief, and trauma in a form that terrified her and fascinated him. He began by framing her episodes through the lens of hysteria, the diagnosis that had dominated much of his early career. Hysteria, in his view, was the manifestation of psychic conflict in the body, an unconscious drama expressed through paralysis, fainting, or convulsions. With this patient, however, the symptoms took on a voice, literally. Her hysterical expressions were not silent or physical but verbal, clothed in the voices of the dead. Freud speculated that these communications were projections of repressed feelings, split-off fragments of her psyche returning in disguised form. Each spirit who spoke might, in fact, represent an aspect of her own memory or desire. The dead she channeled were, in his analysis, not external presences but reflections of her internal conflicts. Yet Freud also acknowledged the uncanny quality of her trances. In his writings, he often explored the concept of the uncanny as the return of the repressed, the familiar made frightening by its sudden reappearance. The patient's voices fit perfectly into this framework. They were voices she knew, voices of loved ones and family, yet their return was terrifying. They reminded her of loss, of absence, of truths she could not face consciously. Freud interpreted her uncanny experiences as the eruption of repressed grief into her waking life. By allowing the dead to speak, she gave form to her own inability to mourn fully, her psychic wound bleeding into the present. The question of knowledge, the unsettling way she seemed to reveal secrets she should not have known, also occupied Freud's analysis. He considered cryptomnesia, the phenomenon where forgotten memories resurface in disguised form. What she presented as revelations from the dead might have been unconscious recollections of things overheard, glimpsed, or half-remembered from childhood. In Freud's view, the unconscious mind stored vast amounts of material inaccessible to conscious recall. In trance, these fragments could rise to the surface, cloaked in the authority of a spirit's voice. This explanation allowed him to maintain his scientific integrity while still accounting for the patient's uncanny abilities. Freud also noted the theatrical nature of her transformations. Her altered voice, her shifting expressions, her bodily tremors. These he linked to dissociation, a splitting of the self under the pressure of trauma. In her trances, she was no longer herself but a series of roles, each carrying a piece of her pain. Where the spiritualists saw possession, Freud saw fragmentation. He argued that the unconscious had a tendency to dramatize itself, turning repressed desires into characters, staging inner conflicts as if they were theatre. The séance, in this sense, was not a communication with the dead but a performance staged by her unconscious for itself and others. Still, Freud could not ignore the broader cultural context. He knew that his patient's claims resonated in a society captivated by séances and spiritualism. He understood that the form her symptoms took was shaped by her environment. Just as medieval patients might have seen visions of demons, and 19th-century women swooned with hysterical fainting, his patient spoke with the dead because Vienna had primed her to. The unconscious borrowed its symbols from the culture surrounding it, and in her case, that culture was saturated with death rituals, séances, and the longing to pierce the veil. Freud's interpretation, therefore, was both personal and historical. She was an individual case, but also a symptom of her time. In his private reflections, Freud admitted a certain fascination with paranormal phenomena. Though he rejected spiritualism as superstition, he never fully closed the door on the possibility that the unconscious might hold power science had not yet explained. He speculated about telepathy, about the strange ways thoughts might travel between minds. Some of his letters reveal that he considered such phenomena worthy of serious investigation, even if publicly he kept his distance. This ambivalence colored his work with the patient. While he framed her voices as psychological, he also sensed that her case brushed against the edges of the unknown. He did not dismiss her entirely as delusional, for to do so would risk ignoring the truth of her suffering. Instead, he sought to translate her supernatural claims into the language of the unconscious. Her case also forced Freud to confront the limitations of psychoanalysis. Could every experience truly be explained as repression? Could every voice be reduced to trauma? His patient challenged him with phenomena that defied neat categorization. While he insisted on a psychological interpretation, the intensity of her episodes left open the possibility that psychoanalysis had not yet reached the full depths of the human mind. In this sense, she represented both a test and a temptation, a reminder that science and mystery often walk the same narrow path. To Freud's critics, his interpretations seemed like evasions. They argued that he minimized the supernatural to protect his theories. Spiritualists accused him of stripping away the truth of her gift, of refusing to acknowledge that she had pierced the veil. But Freud remained consistent. Her voices were symptoms, her séances expressions of repressed grief and unconscious knowledge. Whether or not this satisfied the patient is another question. She continued to live with her trances, caught between Freud's explanations and her own conviction that she was truly a medium. Freud's interpretation of the case ultimately reinforced his broader theories of the unconscious. He saw in her a vivid example of how repression could distort memory, how grief could generate hallucinations, how the unconscious could masquerade as external reality. Yet the shadows of her séances lingered in his mind, perhaps reminding him that psychoanalysis itself was not so far removed from spiritualism. Both sought to give voice to what was hidden, to bring the unseen into speech. The difference lay in Freud's insistence on grounding those voices within the human psyche, not in the realm of the dead. In the end, Freud's interpretation of his patient was both an act of control and an admission of mystery. He framed her as hysterical, dissociated, traumatized, but he also conceded that the unconscious had powers beyond easy explanation. Her voices were not ghosts, but they were real in their impact, and they revealed the uncanny ways grief can blur the line between memory and presence. For Freud, this was enough, not proof of the dead, but proof of the unconscious as a force just as haunting, just as powerful, and perhaps just as frightening as any spirit. The strange case of Freud's patient cannot be understood without examining it through the lens of medicine, both the medicine of her own time and the medical knowledge we possess today. Her claims of speaking with the dead, her trances, her altered voices and visions, all demand a deeper exploration into what might have been happening inside her body and her mind. Freud interpreted her experiences through the framework of psychoanalysis, but when we widen the scope, the picture becomes even more complex. Was she suffering from a psychiatric condition unknown to the physicians of her day? Was she experiencing dissociative states, psychotic episodes, or neurological disturbances that science could not yet map? Or did her symptoms represent a rare overlap of trauma, culture, and belief that medicine still struggles to explain? In Freud's era, diagnostic categories were limited. Physicians spoke of hysteria, neurasthenia, melancholia, terms that carried broad, often vague meanings. Hysteria, in particular, was a diagnosis overwhelmingly applied to women, encompassing everything from fainting spells to convulsions to visions. The patient's trances and voices fit comfortably within this loose definition, and Freud's colleagues might have dismissed her as another hysterical case, her symptoms exaggerated by attention and suggestion. Yet Freud saw something more layered. He considered her visions not as simple delusions but as symbolic expressions of repressed trauma. Even so, his vocabulary was restricted, and conditions we recognize today, such as dissociative identity disorder or schizophrenia, were only beginning to be theorized. If we view her case through modern psychiatry, her symptoms align with several possibilities. Dissociative identity disorder, for instance, often emerges in response to severe trauma, particularly in childhood. Patients may enter trance-like states, speak with altered voices, or assume entirely different identities. Freud's patient, when channeling the dead, could be understood as enacting dissociated parts of herself, giving voice to fragments of her psyche that had been split off to survive grief and trauma. In this sense, the spirits were not supernatural at all but internal selves demanding recognition. Freud's idea of repression resonates here, but modern terms give the phenomenon sharper definition. Schizophrenia provides another possible framework. Hallucinations, particularly auditory ones, are central to the disorder, and voices often emerge with distinct personalities, commenting on or addressing the sufferer. Freud's patient did not simply hear voices, she embodied them, spoke through them, and even seemed to physically transform under their influence. Her visions of shadowy landscapes, her sensations of otherworldly presence, her altered states of consciousness all echo the symptoms of psychotic disorders. At the time, however, schizophrenia was not yet fully identified. The term dementia praecox was only beginning to be used. Had she lived a few decades later, she might have received such a diagnosis. Neurological explanations also demand consideration. Temporal lobe epilepsy, for example, is known to produce vivid hallucinations, mystical experiences, and intense feelings of presence. Patients describe visions of other realms, encounters with divine or ghostly figures, and auditory phenomena resembling voices. Some even report glossolalia, speaking in tongues, or sudden shifts in personality during seizures. If Freud's patient suffered from such a condition, her seances may have been the medical manifestations of an unstable brain. In Freud's time, epilepsy carried great stigma, often misinterpreted as possession or madness. Today, her symptoms might be studied through brain scans and EEGs, revealing disturbances invisible to early physicians. Another angle lies in grief itself. Complicated grief and bereavement hallucinations are well documented even today. Many people who lose loved ones report hearing their voices, seeing them in dreams, or sensing their presence in waking life. For most, these experiences are fleeting, a natural part of mourning. But in vulnerable individuals, grief can spiral into persistent hallucinatory states. Freud's patient, already predisposed by trauma and possibly by neurological sensitivity, may have been consumed by this process. What began as ordinary grief may have deepened into pathological mourning, where the boundary between memory and reality dissolved. Her physical symptoms also deserve scrutiny. Eyewitnesses describe her trembling, sweating, and exhaustion after trances. Such reactions suggest her body was under immense strain, releasing adrenaline, raising her heart rate, and draining her strength. Dissociative states often carry such somatic tolls, as the body mirrors the turmoil of the psyche. Her raw throat after seances hints at the physiological reality of her altered voice. She was not fabricating the change but straining her vocal cords under unconscious compulsion. These details underscore that her condition was not merely in her head in the dismissive sense. It was embodied, lived through every nerve and muscle. What makes her case so enigmatic is that no single diagnosis neatly captures it. She displayed elements of dissociation, psychosis, trauma response, and neurological disturbance, all woven together under the cultural fabric of spiritualism. In another place and time, she might have been institutionalized, medicated, or dismissed. In Vienna, surrounded by seances and spiritualist societies, her symptoms found a ready-made language. She was not merely sick, she was a medium. This cultural frame amplified her experiences, encouraged them, and gave them meaning. Her illness was interpreted not just by doctors but by society itself, which demanded that grief speak through ghosts. For Freud, the medical mysteries of her case were both a challenge and an opportunity. He insisted on psychological explanations, resisting the temptation to assign her condition to madness or fraud. Yet his analysis stopped short of acknowledging the biological underpinnings that modern psychiatry would later uncover. He emphasized repression and trauma but could not diagnose schizophrenia or temporal lobe epilepsy because the concepts were not yet fully developed. His interpretation was therefore both brilliant and incomplete, a testament to the limits of early psychoanalysis and to the enduring difficulty of understanding such phenomena even today. What remains striking is the way her case highlights the porous border between medical and supernatural explanations. The same symptoms can be seen as signs of possession, of trauma, of psychosis, or of neurological disorder, depending on the lens applied. In 1903, Freud chose the language of repression. Today, doctors might choose dissociation or psychosis. But beneath the labels lies the same haunting reality, a woman whose suffering forced her to live at the intersection of science and mystery. The medical mysteries of her case remind us that the human mind is not easily contained by categories. Her voices were both symptoms and experiences, both illness and meaning. Freud's patient was not simply a case study. She was a person caught in the currents of grief, culture, and biology, her body and mind producing phenomena that defied easy explanation. Whether one sees her as hysterical, psychotic, or epileptic, the truth remains elusive. Perhaps that is the enduring lesson, that medicine can explain much, but not everything, and that some mysteries linger at the edges of knowledge, refusing to be resolved. The patient who claimed to speak to the dead did not emerge in a vacuum. She was part of a much larger cultural wave that swept across Europe and the United States during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a surge of spiritualism that captured the imagination of millions. By 1903, when she sat in Freud's consulting room, séances were no longer fringe curiosities. They were fashionable, widely attended, and openly debated in salons, lecture halls, and even universities. To understand her place in history, one must understand the spiritualist surge that surrounded her, a movement that blurred the boundaries between science, religion, and performance, and that gave women like her a stage on which their suffering could be transformed into revelation. The roots of spiritualism stretched back to the 1840s in upstate New York, where the Fox sisters claimed to communicate with spirits through a series of mysterious raps and knocks. Their performances spread like wildfire, igniting a movement that crossed the Atlantic and took root in Europe. By the late 19th century, spiritualism had become a social phenomenon. Mediums traveled from city to city, offering séances for both public audiences and private gatherings. Newspapers reported on their feats, sometimes mocking, sometimes reverent. Even respected scientists found themselves drawn into the debate. Was there genuine evidence of life after death, or was it all a grand deception? The patient in Freud's care entered this world at its height, when belief and skepticism coexisted uneasily, and when every new medium seemed to embody the possibility of a doorway to the beyond. Vienna, with its mix of intellectual rigor and Gothic fascination with death, was fertile soil for spiritualism. The city's obsession with funerals, its elaborate cemeteries, and its pervasive mourning culture made it receptive to the promise of communication with the departed. Aristocrats and intellectuals alike gathered in candlelit rooms to watch tables levitate, to hear phantom knocks, to see mediums exhale ectoplasm, a mysterious substance said to emanate from the body of those who channeled spirits. For many, these spectacles were less about proof than about comfort. Death was omnipresent. Epidemics claimed children, soldiers died on distant borders, and life expectancy was fragile. Spiritualism offered hope that death was not an end but a transformation, that loved ones could still speak across the veil. The patient séances fit neatly into this broader cultural script. Her trances, her voices, her uncanny revelations echoed the performances of better-known mediums such as Eusapia Palladino, an Italian woman whose séances were famous across Europe. Palladino was tested repeatedly by scientists who alternated between debunking her tricks and confessing astonishment at her feats. Like Palladino, Freud's patient occupied a liminal space between theatre and religion, between fraud and faith. She was not a professional medium seeking fortune, yet the cultural momentum of spiritualism shaped the way her symptoms were interpreted. Instead of being dismissed as madness alone, her trances were understood by many as genuine contact with the dead. What made spiritualism particularly powerful in this era was its claim to be scientific. Mediums did not simply ask for belief, they invited investigation. They allowed themselves to be studied by physicists, physicians, and psychologists, who brought instruments to séances in the hope of measuring the paranormal. Photographs were taken of mediums exhaling ghostly shapes, of floating tables, of spectral figures. Though many of these were later revealed as trickery, the very act of documenting them lent spiritualism an aura of credibility. In a world where science was dismantling old religious certainties, spiritualism stepped in to fill the void, cloaking itself in the language of experiment and observation. For Freud's patient, this meant that her voices could be framed not as lunacy but as data, anomalies worthy of study. Another crucial aspect of the movement was its gendered nature. Women dominated the ranks of mediums. In a society that restricted women's voices in politics and public life, spiritualism gave them a unique platform. They could speak with authority, not in their own name but as channels for the dead. Their bodies, often dismissed as weak or hysterical, became the very instruments of revelation. Freud's patient fit this mold perfectly. Her trances allowed her to speak truths otherwise forbidden to her, to command attention from men who might otherwise silence her. In this way, spiritualism intersected with both oppression and empowerment, providing women a paradoxical form of authority through submission to unseen forces. But the surge of spiritualism also attracted its share of frauds. Mediums were exposed using hidden accomplices, mechanical devices, and sleight of hand. Some used telescoping rods to create phantom touches, or concealed trumpets to project ghostly voices. Every revelation seemed to be followed by a scandal. Yet these exposures did little to kill the movement. Believers argued that frauds existed but that true mediums remained. For those desperate to believe, even one genuine case was enough to keep the faith alive. Freud's patient stood at this intersection of faith and doubt. She was not publicly exposed, nor did she pursue fame, and this lent her an authenticity that many professional mediums lacked. Her suffering seemed too genuine, her grief too raw, to be dismissed as theatre. The patient's case also reflects the way spiritualism spread across class lines. It was not confined to drawing rooms of the wealthy. Working-class communities, too, embraced mediums, finding in them solace and empowerment. But in Vienna's elite circles, where Freud moved, spiritualism was both entertainment and intellectual puzzle. Some of Freud's contemporaries attended séances out of curiosity, eager to expose frauds. Others went secretly, unwilling to admit their fascination. For Freud, spiritualism was a cultural phenomenon he could not ignore, even as he dismissed its supernatural claims. His patient embodied its influence, her symptoms shaped by the rituals and language of the séance. By the early 20th century, spiritualism was at its zenith, but cracks were already showing. Investigators increasingly exposed trickery, and skeptics gained louder voices. Still, the movement would endure for decades, leaving a lasting mark on culture, literature, and even psychology. For Freud's patient, it offered a framework that gave meaning to her experiences, transforming her grief into messages from beyond. Without spiritualism, she might have been labeled insane, locked away, her voices dismissed. With it, she became part of a movement that blurred the lines between sickness and revelation, between madness and mysticism. The spiritualist surge was not just a backdrop to her story, it was a force that shaped it. It provided her with rituals, with an audience, with a vocabulary for her suffering. It allowed her to embody the cultural tensions of her time, between science and belief, repression and expression, the living and the dead. Freud's patient, whether seen as hysteric or medium, was also a symbol of a wider hunger that defined her era, a hunger to know that death did not end the story, that voices silenced in life might still find a way to speak. The story of Freud's patient who claimed to speak with the dead cannot be told without acknowledging the voices of doubt that rose against her. Vienna may have been fertile soil for séances and supernatural intrigue, but it was also a city of sharp intellects, critical thinkers, and medical professionals who viewed such phenomena with suspicion. For every gathering that left participants trembling with belief, there were scientists, doctors, and skeptics who sought to expose, explain, or ridicule. Section after section of her life unfolded like a courtroom drama, with believers on one side and skeptics on the other. Her case became less a private tragedy and more a battleground for competing worldviews. Among Freud's colleagues, skepticism towards spiritualism was strong. Psychoanalysis itself was under attack by the medical establishment, accused of being unscientific, speculative, even indecent. To lend credibility to séances would have been suicidal for Freud's reputation, and many in his circle reminded him of this. They argued that his patients' voices were not evidence of life after death but symptoms of hysteria, dissociation, or delusion. They urged him to treat her case clinically, stripping away any hint of the supernatural. For them, every word spoken in her trances was merely the unconscious masquerading as spirit. This view provided safety, explanations grounded in psychology, but it also flattened the mystery of her experience into pathology. Beyond psychoanalysis, the wider scientific community in Vienna and Europe at large launched attacks on mediums and spiritualists. Scientists set elaborate traps for fraudulent performers, hidden chalk marks on tables to detect movement, cameras to catch sleight of hand, even controlled experiments where mediums were restrained. Time and again, many were caught. Eusapia Palladino, one of the most famous mediums of the era, was both celebrated and exposed, sometimes in the same breath. Researchers documented her moving objects with hidden toes, producing phantom touches with concealed rods, and manipulating candle flames. These revelations fueled skepticism and cast a shadow over all who claimed to contact the dead. Even genuine seeming cases, like that of Freud's patient, were tainted by association. Skeptics could point to countless frauds as proof that hers must also be deception or self-delusion. Journalists played a crucial role in feeding skepticism. Viennese newspapers reported eagerly on seances, but just as often they ridiculed them. Cartoons mocked mediums as charlatans fleecing the gullible. Articles detailed exposures with biting sarcasm, painting believers as fools. The press turned spiritualism into both spectacle and scandal, ensuring that no medium could escape scrutiny. Freud's patient, though not a public performer, became caught in this climate of suspicion. The very idea of her seances was enough to make skeptics roll their eyes, no matter how sincere her suffering. Another layer of criticism came from religious authorities. The Catholic Church, influential in Austria, condemned spiritualism as heresy and danger. Priests warned that those who sought contact with the dead were inviting demons, not loved ones. They dismissed mediums as either frauds or vessels of evil. This moral denunciation placed Freud's patient in an even more precarious position. To skeptics, she was deluded. To priests, she was damned. Between these forces, her voice became less a revelation and more an object of suspicion. Yet not all critics dismissed her cruelly. Some scientists and physicians attempted more compassionate explanations. They suggested that her seances were products of autosuggestion, that her trances were similar to hypnotic states in which the mind produced extraordinary phenomena. They noted that grief could easily generate hallucinations, and that memory could deceive even the most honest individual. In this sense, they saw her not as a fraud but as a victim of her own psyche. Their skepticism was not hostile but paternalistic, an attempt to protect her from ridicule by translating her experiences into medical terms. Still, their dismissals erased the possibility that her voices carried meaning beyond pathology. For Freud, the critics' voices echoed in his own struggle. He knew that engaging too openly with her supernatural claims could destroy his standing among colleagues. He also knew that dismissing her too harshly would silence the very material he needed to analyze. His compromise was to interpret her voices as symptoms of repression, a stance that allowed him to remain within scientific respectability while still acknowledging her suffering. But even this drew criticism. Some skeptics accused Freud of being too indulgent, of allowing superstition to creep into his clinic under the disguise of psychology. Others mocked psychoanalysis itself as little better than seance, a theater of the unconscious dressed in scientific language. This tension reveals the precarious role of skepticism in her case. On one hand, it provided necessary defenses against fraud and exploitation. Without skeptics, the spiritualist surge might have swept unchecked, leaving countless people prey to trickery. On the other hand, skepticism often failed to grasp the personal dimension of cases like hers. By treating her solely as deluded or hysterical, critics overlooked the depth of her grief, the cultural weight of her visions, and the possibility that her experiences contained truths not reducible to trickery. The skeptics also highlight a broader truth about the age. Science itself was haunted by what it sought to banish. Even as critics exposed frauds, they remained fascinated by the possibility of the unknown. Many who attended seances went with the express purpose of debunking them, yet left shaken, unable to fully dismiss what they had seen. Doubt and belief coexisted in uneasy partnership. For Freud's patient, this meant that even her harshest critics were never entirely free from the questions she embodied. What if grief really could open a door? What if the voices of the dead were not entirely illusions? In the end, the skeptics did not silence her story, they amplified it. Every denunciation, every exposure, every article mocking mediums kept the subject alive in the public imagination. The louder the critics shouted fraud, the more the curious wanted to witness seances for themselves. Freud's patient was caught in this paradox. She was dismissed, pitted, even condemned, yet she remained at the center of a conversation that refused to die. Her very existence forced skeptics to sharpen their arguments and believers to deepen their faith. Her legacy, filtered through skepticism, reminds us that disbelief is never simple. It can protect, it can wound, it can challenge, and it can inspire. For Freud's patient, skepticism was both her cage and her stage, limiting how she was seen, but ensuring she would not be forgotten. And for Freud, The critics surrounding her served as a constant reminder that his work walked a dangerous line. Psychoanalysis had to prove itself against accusations of unscientific fantasy. His patients' voices, whether seen as symptoms or spirits, made that task infinitely more complicated. The aftermath of Freud's patient, the woman who claimed she could speak to the dead, was not the tidy conclusion of a case neatly solved, but rather a fading echo that continued to disturb the shadows of psychoanalytic history. What became of her after the seances, the trances, and the whispered controversies? The records are scarce, obscured by Freud's deliberate use of pseudonyms and the secrecy of his clinical files. Yet from the fragments that remain, we can piece together the uncertain trajectory of her life and the quiet impact she left on Freud's own intellectual journey. Her story did not end with revelation or cure, but with ambiguity, silence, and the uneasy sense that something unresolved lingered in the rooms where she once spoke with the dead. For Freud, patients were often written into his work under disguise. He changed names, altered details, and framed their stories as case histories that served his theoretical ends. This woman, however, never received the prominence of cases like Anna O. or Dora. Perhaps her claims of supernatural communication were too controversial, too threatening to his credibility. Perhaps he could not reconcile them fully with his theories. Whatever the reason, she became a kind of ghost within his writings, present in implication, absent in detail. Her seances, which had rattled Vienna salons, were scarcely acknowledged in the scientific papers he published. It was as if he had locked her away in a corner of his professional memory, a reminder of the limits of analysis he was unwilling to advertise. This erasure raises questions about what became of her personally. Did Freud continue to treat her, guiding her through the labyrinth of grief and repression until her vision subsided? Or did she drift away from his care, carrying her voices with her into obscurity? Some accounts suggest that patients like her often cycled through doctors, never finding relief. Others hint that she may have withdrawn from public attention, retreating into private life where her voices could no longer be scrutinized. What is certain is that she did not become a public figure. Unlike professional mediums who courted fame, she disappeared into the folds of history, leaving behind only traces of the scandal and fascination she once evoked. For Freud himself, the aftermath of her case was more complex. His lifelong ambivalence toward the supernatural only deepened in the years that followed. Publicly, he distanced himself from spiritualism, maintaining the facade of strict scientific rationalism. Privately, however, his correspondence reveals moments of curiosity, letters in which he entertained the possibility of telepathy, of uncanny coincidences, of psychic phenomena that psychology could not yet explain. The patient who spoke with the dead may not have changed his theories outright, but she seems to have haunted the margins of his thought, a reminder that the unconscious was stranger and more unruly than he dared admit. Her case also underscored the precarious balance Freud had to maintain between innovation and respectability. He was already viewed as a radical, even a heretic, for his insistence on sexuality as the root of neurosis. To embrace a patient's supernatural claims would have invited ridicule that could destroy his career. Thus, her aftermath became one of erasure, not only of her name but of her story's supernatural dimensions. By stripping her case from the official record, Freud preserved psychoanalysis as a science in the eyes of his peers. Yet in doing so, he may have silenced one of the most intriguing encounters of his career. The woman herself, meanwhile, was left with the aftermath of her own condition. If her visions persisted, they would have set her apart from society, a source of fear and isolation. If they faded, she would have been left with the hollow silence of grief, the loss of both her loved ones and the strange voices that had kept them alive for her. Either path carried loneliness. In a culture quick to label women hysterical or insane, she would have had few safe spaces to process her experience. Freud's office, for all its limitations, may have been the only place she could speak openly. Once that door closed, she likely faced the aftermath in solitude. Beyond the personal, the cultural aftermath of her case rippled through Vienna and beyond. Her seances became part of the whispered lore of Freud's practice, a story passed along in fragments, never officially acknowledged but never fully forgotten. For the wider spiritualist community, she was just one of many voices in a chorus of mediums who blurred the line between science and mysticism. But for those who knew of her connection to Freud, she carried an added weight. She represented the collision of psychoanalysis with the supernatural, the moment when the father of modern psychology had to confront the possibility that his patients might embody mysteries beyond repression. In the decades after 1903, spiritualism itself began to wane. The First World War would later bring a resurgence of seances as millions sought contact with lost sons and fathers, but the intellectual glamour of the movement faded under the weight of exposure and fraud. Freud, by then, had turned his focus to dream analysis, the Oedipus complex, and the architecture of the unconscious. His writings rarely touched on the supernatural again, except in the context of the uncanny or the psychology of religion. Yet the patient who spoke to the dead lingered as an unacknowledged reminder that the unconscious could generate experiences indistinguishable from the paranormal. For history, the aftermath of her case lies in its absence. She was not canonized in Freud's great case histories, not celebrated in the annals of spiritualism, not remembered in Vienna's cultural chronicles. She became a ghost in every sense, a figure who slipped from the record, known only through whispers and speculation. And yet this very absence is telling. It speaks to the discomfort her story caused, the way it unsettled both science and society. Her aftermath was not fame or resolution but disappearance, leaving behind only the unsettling knowledge that something extraordinary had once taken place, something that could not be neatly explained. Even in silence, however, she shaped the trajectory of Freud's thought. His later writings on the uncanny, on telepathy, and on the persistence of memory bear the trace of her influence. Though he never credited her, the question she raised about the boundary between psyche and spirit continued to haunt his work. Her case became a kind of negative space, a presence defined by what was left unsaid. And in that sense, her aftermath is ongoing. Each time historians revisit Freud's career, each time spiritualism is studied as a cultural force, her story re-emerges, unfinished, demanding to be heard. The aftermath of Freud's patient is, then, an aftermath without closure. For her, it may have meant a return to obscurity, carrying her voices in silence. For Freud, it meant suppressing a dangerous case while quietly absorbing its lessons. For culture, it meant adding one more shadow to the already haunted landscape of Vienna's spiritualist surge. And for us, it leaves a lingering unease, the sense that a truth remains buried, that behind the polished surface of Freud's theories lay a case too strange to fit the framework, a story erased because it did not align with science, yet too compelling to disappear entirely. The dark legacy of Freud's patient who spoke to the dead is not confined to the narrow lanes of Berggasse 19 or the whispered reports of Vienna salons. Her story lives on as part of a broader cultural obsession, one that lingers even now, in our fascination with ghosts, seances, and the mysteries of the human mind. To understand that legacy, one must see how her case did more than unsettle Freud. It echoed outward, feeding into a cultural hunger that blurred the line between madness and mysticism, grief and revelation, science and superstition. At its heart, her legacy lies in the way her suffering was transformed into a spectacle. In Freud's consulting room, she was a patient, a woman torn apart by grief and repression. Outside, she became part of a narrative that fascinated and horrified in equal measure. To speak with the dead was not only a claim of supernatural power, it was also a challenge to social order. Death was supposed to silence. To hear voices from beyond meant that silence had been broken, that the natural boundary between the living and the departed had been violated. Such a violation carried a thrill, but also a profound dread. It threatened the fragile illusion of closure that society depended on to survive its endless encounters with mortality. Her legacy also lies in the way her story intersected with the image of women in her era. Mediums were almost always women, figures both pitied and feared. They embodied vulnerability, but also a strange authority. Freud's patient carried both roles. She was seen as fragile, suffering from hysteria, yet when she entered a trance, her voice commanded a room. This paradox fueled the cultural anxiety around her. If she was deluded, she was pitiable. If she was genuine, she was dangerous. Either way, she unsettled the patriarchal order, giving voice to the silenced, speaking truths that society wished to bury with its dead. The dark legacy of her case also emerges in the way it highlighted the limits of medicine. Freud and his colleagues tried to fit her into categories: hysteria, repression, dissociation, but none could contain the full strangeness of her experience. This failure became part of the haunting. If medicine could not explain her, did that mean something supernatural lurked in her symptoms? Or did it mean that science itself was inadequate, that the human mind was stranger than any theory could capture? The tension between these possibilities ensured that her story would continue to trouble both skeptics and believers. In the broader culture, her legacy is intertwined with the rise of spiritualist folklore. Stories like hers fed a growing body of ghost tales, popular literature, and Gothic imagination. Newspapers sensationalized seances, novels dramatized the voices of the dead, and stage performers blended illusion with genuine belief. Even as skeptics exposed frauds, the allure of the supernatural only grew stronger. Freud's patient, though obscure, was part of this wave. Her trances and voices mirrored the experiences recounted in countless other circles, reinforcing the idea that communication with the dead was not merely possible but frighteningly common. The darker side of her legacy, however, lies in exploitation. Women like her were often manipulated by those who saw profit in their suffering. Mediums were displayed for money, tested by scientists as curiosities, mocked by journalists, and judged by priests. The patient who spoke to the dead became not just a person but a cultural commodity. Her grief was consumed by others, by believers seeking solace, by skeptics seeking amusement, by doctors seeking theories. This exploitation turned private suffering into public spectacle, and it is part of the unease her story leaves behind. Her case also reminds us of the dangerous overlap between belief and delusion. The line between comfort and madness is razor-thin when it comes to the dead. For some, her voices offered reassurance that life continued after death. For others, they revealed the abyss of mental illness. This duality is her legacy, the way her story continues to provoke debate about what we consider real, and how much of reality is shaped by longing. She stands as a warning that the human mind, in its grief, can create entire worlds, and that those worlds can be both healing and destructive. Freud's patient also left a legacy for psychoanalysis itself. Though Freud suppressed the supernatural elements of her case, the questions she raised continued to haunt his work. His later writings on the uncanny, on dreams, and on the return of the repressed all echo the themes of her voices. She forced him to confront the possibility that the unconscious might appear not just in slips of the tongue or dreams but in full-bodied apparitions of the dead. This realization deepened his exploration of how the mind masks its truths, how memory disguises itself, and how trauma can speak in voices that feel alien to the self. Even though he never acknowledged her openly, her legacy can be traced in the shadows of his theories. Perhaps the most chilling element of her legacy is the way it resonates today. We live in an age where science explains more than ever, yet belief in ghosts, mediums, and the afterlife persists. Freud's patient is part of that enduring fascination. She embodies the unresolved tension between rationalism and superstition, between the authority of medicine and the power of grief. Every time we tell her story, we are reminded that death is never fully silent, that the human mind can conjure voices that shake our certainty about what is real. Her legacy is not one of clarity but of haunting. She remains an enigma, a figure suspended between hysteria and mediumship, between science and myth. She is remembered not for resolution but for disturbance, for leaving behind a question that cannot be answered. Did she truly speak to the dead, or did her mind betray her with echoes of her own sorrow? That question is her legacy, and it lingers still, like a faint voice heard in the dark, reminding us that some mysteries refuse to die. The story of Freud's patient who claimed she could speak to the dead ends, not with certainty, but with questions that continue to echo more than a century later. Vienna in 1903 gave us a stage on which science, superstition, grief, and psychology collided, and at the center of it stood one woman whose voice seemed to cross the boundaries of life and death. To conclude her tale is to reflect on what it reveals not only about Freud and his era, but also about us, about our enduring need to find meaning in the silence of the grave, and about the shadows that haunt the human mind. For Freud, her case became part of a personal and professional tension that lasted his entire life. Publicly, he insisted that the dead did not speak. He explained her voices as repressed memories, her visions as psychic projections, her seances as the unconscious staging its dramas. This interpretation preserved his reputation, aligning him with the rising authority of science. Yet privately, his letters and reflections reveal a man who never fully dismissed the uncanny. He admitted to moments of belief in telepathy, to being unsettled by coincidences that defied reason, to wondering whether the unconscious itself might possess powers beyond what theory could grasp. His patient embodied this conflict perfectly. She was a living reminder that the line between science and mystery is often thinner than it appears. Her conclusion is also Freud's, a refusal to decide entirely. Was she a hysteric, trapped in trauma? A medium, truly channeling the voices of the dead? Or something in between, a woman whose grief generated phenomena that defied neat categories? Freud never gave a final answer, and perhaps that is why her story endures. Certainty kills mystery, ambiguity keeps it alive. In leaving her unresolved, Freud left us with a case that continues to disturb and fascinate, a story as unfinished as grief itself. The woman herself fades from the record, but her legacy persists in the way her story forces us to face uncomfortable truths. Death is the one universal certainty, and yet humans have always resisted its silence. We bury, we mourn, we pray, we imagine, and sometimes we claim to hear voices that break through the barrier. Whether or not she truly spoke with the dead, Freud's patient reminds us that the desire for such contact is profoundly human. Her story is not simply about madness or fraud. It is about the unbearable weight of loss and the lengths to which the mind will go to survive it. Culturally, she reflects Vienna's paradox, its obsession with both progress and decay. A city of Freud, Klimt, and Schamberg, it was also a city of seances, funerals, and shadows. In this environment, her trances were not anomalies but natural extensions of a culture that waltzed with death. Her conclusion, then, is also Vienna's, a reminder that beneath the glittering veneer of modernity lay a deep anxiety about mortality, one that gave rise to both psychoanalysis and spiritualism. One tried to master the unconscious, the other tried to master death. Both revealed the same truth, that humans cannot bear silence. Her story also concludes with us, the listeners, more than a century later. We live in a world saturated with technology, science, and rational explanations. Yet ghost stories still fill our screens, seances still take place in quiet rooms, and people still report hearing voices of the departed. We may not sit in candlelit parlors anymore, but we scroll through forums, watch paranormal documentaries, and whisper about haunted houses. Freud's patient belongs to this continuum, a figure who reminds us that no matter how advanced our knowledge becomes, death retains its mystery. Her conclusion is that there is no conclusion, only the persistence of questions we cannot extinguish. Thematically, her story asks us to confront what it means to listen. She claimed to listen to the dead. Freud listened to her, translating her voices into the language of repression. We, too, listen now, across time, to her ghostly echoes. In doing so, we reveal something about ourselves, our hunger to hear beyond silence, our need to believe that voices carry on. Whether her voices came from the unconscious or the beyond, they compel us to consider that perhaps the difference matters less than the meaning they gave her life. In the end, her story closes not with resolution but with an image, a woman seated in a darkened room, her eyes closed, her voice shifting into tones not her own, speaking names that cause the living to weep. Around her, candles flicker, Freud listens, skeptics scoff, believers tremble. A century passes, and still we lean closer to hear her. Did she bring back the dead, or did she reveal the hidden power of the human mind to create them? We cannot know. What we know is that she forces us to acknowledge the limits of our certainty. Her legacy, like her conclusion, is haunting. She remains suspended between categories, between explanations, between worlds. To call her cured, mad, fraudulent, or gifted is to simplify what was, in truth, a deeply human tragedy. A woman crushed by grief who found her only voice in the voices of the dead. Freud's patient reminds us that sometimes the boundaries we cling to, between life and death, sanity and madness, science and superstition, are not walls but thin veils, easily pierced by longing. And so, the conclusion of her story is not an ending but a question that hangs in the air, unanswered, as it did in Freud's consulting room in 1903. When the dead speak, are we hearing them, or are we hearing ourselves?